The pounding on my front door came just after sunrise, loud enough to shake the glass panels and wake the entire house. Whoever stood outside clearly wasn't interested in patience. The knocking sounded like a command, not a request. I stepped into the hallway, still holding my morning coffee, wondering what kind of emergency could possibly justify such aggression at 6:30 in the morning. Before I even reached the door, I heard a woman shouting from outside. "Open this door immediately. WA inspection." The voice was sharp, confident, and dripping with authority that didn't belong to her. Through the window I saw several police officers standing on my porch, their expressions somewhere between confused and tired. Behind them stood the neighborhood's most notorious troublemaker, Karen from the Homeowners Association. She looked furious. Clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon, she pointed toward my house dramatically as if she were presenting evidence in a courtroom drama. "This homeowner has violated multiple WA rules," she told the officers loudly. "Unauthorized landscaping, illegal fence height, and possibly operating a business from the property." I almost laughed. None of that was true. But Karen had a reputation. She loved power, and if she thought someone broke a rule, real or imagined, she treated it like a federal crime. I opened the door calmly. "Good morning," I said. Karen didn't return the greeting. Instead, she stepped forward aggressively. "You are required to allow an immediate WA inspection," she snapped. "I've already contacted law enforcement to ensure compliance." One of the officers shifted awkwardly. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "WA matters usually don't involve police unless there's something criminal happening." Karen waved him off. "That's exactly what I'm investigating." She turned back to me with a smug expression. "You have two choices," she said. "Let us search the property now, or face legal consequences." The words hung in the air. The officers looked uncomfortable, and I simply took a slow sip of my coffee. "You're sure about this?" I asked calmly. Karen smirked. "Absolutely." That's when one of the officers leaned closer to me and spoke quietly. "Sir, she insisted we come out here. Said the violations were serious." I nodded slowly. "Oh, I believe she did." Then Karen raised her voice again. "Officers, please proceed with the inspection." The officers hesitated. They clearly knew something felt off. But Karen had already committed to the performance. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that this so-called raid was about to explode into the most humiliating mistake of her entire life. Because the moment those officers asked for identification, they were going to realize something Karen hadn't bothered to check. The homeowner she was threatening with legal consequences was the very judge who presided over the county courthouse. And in exactly 60 seconds, Karen's power trip was about to collapse spectacularly. The morning air on the porch had grown strangely quiet. Karen still stood with her clipboard raised like a badge of authority, but the officers were beginning to sense that something about the situation didn't add up. One officer cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Sir, before we go any further, could we please see some identification?" Karen crossed her arms triumphantly, clearly expecting this moment. "Yes," she said sharply. "Let's verify exactly who we're dealing with." I set my coffee mug on the porch railing and reached calmly into my pocket. The officers watched politely, but Karen leaned forward eagerly, almost impatient to see the supposed criminal she believed she had caught. I handed the officer my identification. The moment his eyes landed on the card, his expression froze. He blinked once, then twice. The officer beside him leaned over to look as well. Within seconds, the mood on the porch changed completely. Karen noticed the sudden silence and frowned. "Well," she demanded, "what does it say?" The first officer straightened his posture instantly, like a soldier snapping to attention. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said respectfully. Karen's confident expression collapsed into confusion. What?" The officer handed the ID back to me carefully. "Apologies for the disturbance, Judge," he said. "We weren't aware." The second officer nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. We were called here regarding an HOA complaint." Karen blinked rapidly, trying to process what she had just heard. "Judge," she repeated, her voice suddenly uncertain. I picked up my coffee again and gave a small nod. "That's correct." Her face drained of color. "No, that can't be right," she said. "You're just a homeowner." One of the officers turned toward her. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "this is Judge Daniel Harper." Karen stared at me like the ground had just disappeared beneath her feet. But he's violating WA regulations, she insisted weakly. The officers exchanged a glance. The first officer spoke again. Ma'am, WA violations are civil matters. Police don't conduct home inspections. Karen's voice rose again, though now it carried a trace of panic. He refused compliance. I tilted my head slightly. You never asked, I said calmly. You demanded. Karen gripped her clipboard tighter. I have the authority as WA president. The second officer shook his head. Ma'am, you cannot order a police raid over landscaping complaints. The word raid seemed to echo louder than expected. Karen looked around nervously now. Her dramatic performance from minutes earlier had suddenly lost its audience. But she wasn't ready to surrender yet. She pointed toward my backyard. There could still be illegal structures, she argued. The inspection must proceed. The officers hesitated. Then the first officer spoke slowly. Ma'am, we are not searching a judge's property based on WA speculation. Karen's lips tightened. Her plan was collapsing fast. But the worst part hadn't happened yet. Because just as she opened her mouth to argue again, one of the office's radios crackled. Dispatch had an update, and what they were about to say was going to make Karen's situation far worse than anyone on that porch expected. Karen opened her mouth to argue again, but before another word could leave her lips, the officer's radio crackled loudly. Unit 12, please confirm location. The officer lifted the radio. Unit 12 at Maple Ridge Drive, responding to WA complaint. There was a brief pause. Then dispatch replied, copy that, stand by. The porch fell silent again. Karen tapped her clipboard nervously, trying to reclaim control of the situation. Well, she said impatiently, go ahead with the inspection. Neither officer moved. They both seemed far more interested in what dispatch was about to say. A second later, the radio spoke again. Unit 12, additional information received regarding the caller. The officer raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. Dispatch continued. The caller reported suspected criminal activity and requested officers conduct a forced compliance inspection. The officer slowly turned toward Karen. Ma'am, did you tell dispatch there was criminal activity here? Karen hesitated. Well, I said there might be. The second officer frowned. Based on what evidence? Karen waved her clipboard again. These violations are serious. The first officer spoke calmly. Ma'am, landscaping and fence height are not crimes. Karen shifted uncomfortably. They could lead to property damage. The officers exchanged another look. Dispatch spoke again through the radio. Unit 12, be advised the homeowner is listed in county records as Judge Daniel Harper. The officer sighed softly. Confirmed, he replied. We've already verified. Karen looked like she might faint. But dispatch wasn't finished. There's more, the voice continued. The officer straightened slightly. Go ahead. Dispatch spoke clearly now. The WA caller also requested officers remove the homeowner from the property if he refused compliance. The officer slowly lowered the radio. Then both officers turned toward Karen. At the exact same time, Karen's face turned bright red. I didn't mean remove him exactly, she said quickly. The first officer crossed his arms. Ma'am, requesting that police remove a homeowner from his own house requires a legal reason. Karen tried to recover. He's breaking WA law. The officer corrected her gently. WA rules are not criminal law. Karen's confidence was now almost completely gone. She glanced toward me nervously. I simply stood there, quietly sipping my coffee. Watching. Waiting. The second officer spoke carefully. Ma'am, making false claims to dispatch can become a serious issue. Karen's eyes widened. I wasn't lying. Then what crime did you believe was happening here? The officer asked. Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time that morning, she had no answer. The porch felt heavier now. The confidence Karen had arrived with was gone. And the officers were no longer treating this like a simple misunderstanding. Now they were asking questions. Important questions. Questions that could turn her WA power trip into something far more serious. Karen looked around nervously, as if searching for an escape route. But there wasn't one, because the officers were already beginning to realize something troubling. This entire situation might have started with a false report. And if that turned out to be true, Karen wasn't the authority figure anymore. She was the problem. Karen's confident posture had completely disappeared. The woman who arrived shouting orders now looked like someone trying to keep a house of cards from collapsing. Her grip tightened around the clipboard. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said quickly. The officers didn't look convinced. The first officer spoke calmly. "Ma'am, dispatch records every call. When someone reports criminal activity, we are required to respond." Karen nodded too quickly. "Yes, exactly. That's why you're here." The second officer shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "we're here because you reported criminal activity at this address." Karen looked back toward my house as if it might suddenly produce evidence to support her story. It didn't. The quiet neighborhood street remained exactly as it had been all morning, peaceful, calm, and completely free of crime. One officer gestured toward the clipboard. "Can we see the violations you mentioned?" Karen hesitated, then handed it over. The officer scanned the page. His expression slowly turned into something between confusion and disbelief. "Overgrown hedges," he read aloud. He flipped to the next page. "Mailbox paint color." Another page. "Fence height exceeding WA recommendation by 2 inches." The officer looked up. "Ma'am, these are WA complaints." Karen nodded firmly. "Yes, serious ones." The second officer sighed. "These are not criminal offenses." Karen tried again. "But they violate community rules." The first officer handed the clipboard back. "That's a civil matter between the WA and the homeowner." Karen's voice rose again. "But he refused inspection." I spoke calmly for the first time in several minutes. "You never requested permission," I said. "You demanded entry with police." The officers looked back at Karen. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She didn't have an answer. The second officer spoke carefully now. "Ma'am, did you tell dispatch that the homeowner was refusing lawful police orders?" Karen froze. "Well, I may have said something like that." The officer nodded slowly. "That's considered a false report if the claim isn't accurate." Karen's breathing became noticeably faster. No, I was just trying to explain the situation." The first officer stepped forward slightly. "Did the homeowner threaten anyone?" "No." "Did you witness a crime?" "No." "Did you see anything dangerous?" Karen hesitated. "Number." The officer folded his arms. "Then why did you call police instead of the HOA board or a civil attorney?" Karen stared down at her clipboard like it might rescue her. It didn't. For the first time that morning, the power dynamic had completely reversed. The officers were no longer looking at me with suspicion. They were looking at Karen. And they were beginning to realize that the person who demanded the police raid might be the one who misused them. Karen suddenly looked toward me again. The confidence was gone. Now there was only nervousness. "Judge, maybe we can resolve this privately," she said carefully. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh," I said calmly. "Yes," she said quickly. "The WA might reconsider the inspection." The officers glanced at each other. Karen was trying to walk this back. But it might already be too late. Because the officer's radio crackled again. And the next message from dispatch was about to make Karen's situation dramatically worse. Karen was still standing there trying to look calm when the officer's radio crackled again. "Unit 12, additional information regarding the caller." The officer lifted the radio. "Go ahead." Dispatch spoke clearly. "Caller identity confirmed as Karen Mitchell, president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association." Karen straightened slightly, as if hearing her title might restore some authority. But the radio message wasn't finished. "Be advised, this is the third police request from the same caller this month." The officers slowly looked at her. Karen's eyes widened. The first officer spoke carefully into the radio. "Dispatch, confirm that." "Confirmed," dispatch replied. 2 previous calls regarding WA violations." The officer sighed quietly. "Understood." He lowered the radio and turned toward Karen. "Ma'am, you've called police 3 times over WA complaints." Karen quickly raised her hands defensively. "Well, someone has to enforce the rules." The second officer shook his head. "That's not the job of law enforcement." Karen's voice sharpened again. "Then what are we supposed to do when homeowners refuse to cooperate?" The officer answered calmly. "You follow civil procedures." Karen pointed toward my house again. "But he's breaking community standards." I leaned against the porch railing and spoke quietly. "Actually, Every modification on my property was approved by the city. Karen turned toward me sharply. That doesn't matter. Law rules override. She stopped mid-sentence. The officers were staring at her. The first officer finished the sentence for her. No, they don't. Karen blinked rapidly. Of course they do. The officer shook his head. City law always overrides HOA policy. Karen's grip tightened on her clipboard again. That's not how our association works. The officer spoke slowly. That might be how you think it works. The tension on the porch grew heavier. Karen had walked into this situation believing she had total authority. Now, every assumption she made was collapsing. But dispatch wasn't finished yet. The radio crackled again. Unit 12, there's another note attached to the previous calls. The officer lifted the radio. Again. Go ahead. Dispatch continued. Previous responding officers noted the caller was warned about misuse of emergency services. The porch went completely silent. Karen looked like she had just been hit by lightning. That's not true, she said quickly. The officer lowered the radio again. Ma'am, the report says you were advised to use civil channels instead of calling police. Karen shook her head rapidly. They misunderstood. The second officer crossed his arms. Did they? Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the third time that morning. She had no explanation. The officer spoke again. Ma'am, knowingly making false or exaggerated emergency reports can lead to penalties. Karen's voice cracked slightly. I wasn't exaggerating. The officer gestured toward the clipboard again. Overgrown hedges aren't an emergency. Karen's confidence had finally disappeared. She looked toward me again, hoping for support. But I remained calm, watching. Because now the situation had moved far beyond HOA rules. This wasn't about fences anymore. It was about whether Karen had abused the emergency system to harass a homeowner. And if that was true, the consequences could become very real. Karen swallowed nervously. Officer, maybe we should just forget about this. But the officer's next words made her stomach drop. Ma'am, it's a little late for that. Karen's face had turned pale. The confidence she carried onto my porch that morning was completely gone. Now she looked like someone realizing a simple mistake had turned into something far more serious. The first officer stepped slightly closer to her. Ma'am, we need to clarify a few things. Karen forced a nervous smile. Of course, I'm happy to cooperate. The officer nodded. When you called dispatch this morning, what exactly did you report? Karen glanced at the officers, then toward me, clearly choosing her words carefully. I said there were serious HOA violations. The officer shook his head. That's not what dispatch recorded. Karen blinked. What do you mean? The officer looked down at the notes on his phone. You reported suspected criminal activity and requested officers remove a non-compliant homeowner. Karen immediately shook her head. No, that's not what I meant. The second officer spoke calmly. But that's what was communicated. Karen's breathing grew heavier. I was just trying to get someone's attention. The first officer nodded slowly. That part worked. Karen tried to laugh weakly. Well, then the problem is solved, right? Neither officer smiled. This isn't really about the hedges anymore, the officer said. Karen swallowed. What do you mean? The officer explained carefully. When someone calls emergency services and reports criminal behavior, we are required to respond immediately. Karen nodded quickly. Yes, that's exactly why I called. But, the officer continued, if the report is knowingly exaggerated or false, that becomes misuse of emergency services. Karen's eyes widened again. I didn't lie. The officer asked another question. Did you believe a crime was happening here? Karen hesitated. Well, not exactly. The officer raised an eyebrow. Then why describe it that way? Karen struggled for an answer. I thought it would make the situation more urgent. The officers exchanged a quiet glance. That single sentence had changed everything. The second officer spoke more firmly now. Ma'am, exaggerating a situation to get a faster police response is exactly what misuse laws address. Karen's voice became shaky. I didn't realize that. The officer nodded. Most people don't until it's explained. Karen looked around the quiet street, clearly hoping neighbors weren't watching. Unfortunately for her, they were. Several curtains had moved. 2 people stood across the road pretending to check their mail. Word was spreading quickly. Karen tried one last time to regain control. This whole thing started because he refused WA inspection. The officer looked toward me. Sir, were you refusing inspection? I answered calmly. She never scheduled one. She showed up with police. The officer nodded. Understood. Karen's shoulders slumped. Everything she had built her argument on was falling apart. The clipboard, the accusations, the dramatic entrance with police. None of it mattered anymore. Because the focus had shifted completely. Now the officers were investigating her call. And whether she had misused their authority to intimidate a homeowner. Karen finally spoke again, quietly. So, what happens now? The officer's answer made her stomach drop. Now we document everything. Karen's face went completely white. Because documentation meant reports, and reports meant records, and records meant something far worse for an HOA president obsessed with authority. Accountability. Karen stood frozen on the porch as the officers began writing their report. The scratching sound of a pen on paper suddenly felt louder than the earlier shouting. For the first time that morning, Karen realized she was no longer in control of anything. The first officer looked up from his notes. Ma'am, we're going to document the details of the call and what happened here today. Karen tried to steady her voice. Is that really necessary? The officer nodded. Yes. The second officer added calmly, anytime emergency services are dispatched under questionable circumstances, we're required to file a report. Karen forced another uneasy smile. But this was just a misunderstanding. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he finished writing another line before looking back at her. Maybe, he said, but that's not for us to decide. Karen blinked nervously. What do you mean? The officer closed his notebook. It means the report goes to the department supervisor. Karen's eyes widened. And sometimes, he continued, they forward cases like this to the city attorney. The words hit Karen like a brick. City attorney, she repeated. The officer nodded. They determine whether misuse of emergency services occurred. Karen's breathing quickened. That sounds serious. The officer answered simply. It can be. Karen suddenly looked toward me again. Her voice was noticeably softer now. Judge, maybe we can clear this up. I calmly folded my arms. Oh, yes, she said quickly. I'm sure the WA board would be willing to drop the inspection request. The officers exchanged another quiet glance. Karen was clearly trying to undo the damage. But the situation had already moved far beyond WA complaints. The second officer spoke gently but firmly. Ma'am, this isn't about the inspection anymore. Karen's shoulders sagged. But the WA rules. The officer interrupted politely. WA rules don't involve the police unless there's a real crime. Karen stared at the ground for a moment. Then she muttered quietly, I was just trying to enforce the neighborhood standards. The first officer replied calmly. There are legal ways to do that. Karen finally looked around the street again. Now several neighbors were openly watching. One man across the road leaned against his mailbox. A woman down the block had stepped onto her porch. Karen's dramatic raid had turned into a public embarrassment. The clipboard she once held proudly now hung loosely at her side. The officer finished writing the final line in his report. He tore the page carefully and placed it in a folder. All right, he said. Karen looked up nervously. All right, what? The officer explained. This report will be submitted to the department. For review. Karen swallowed. And then, the officer answered honestly. They'll decide if further action is necessary. Karen looked like she might collapse. The authority she believed she had used that morning had completely backfired. Instead of punishing a homeowner, she had placed herself under investigation. The first officer turned toward me respectfully. Again, Your Honor, we apologize for the disturbance. I nodded. No problem, officer. Karen stood silently beside them, looking smaller by the second. But the moment that truly ended her WA power trip hadn't happened yet. Because just before the officers left, one of them asked a simple question. And Karen's answer was about to make the entire situation even worse. Karen stood silently on the porch as the officers prepared to leave. The entire street had transformed into a quiet audience. Neighbors pretended to sweep sidewalks, check mailboxes, or water plants, but everyone was clearly watching the aftermath of Karen's failed power play. The first officer closed the folder containing his report. All right, he said calmly. We're finished here. Karen nodded weakly. Good, good. But before stepping off the porch, the second officer paused. There's just one last question, ma'am. Karen forced a smile. Of course. The officer looked directly at her. Did you inform the rest of the HOA board before calling the police today? Karen froze. The silence that followed was immediate and uncomfortable. Well, no, she admitted quietly. The officer raised an eyebrow. So this decision was made entirely by you? Karen hesitated again. Yes. The first officer slowly nodded. That's important information. Karen's nervous smile vanished. Why? The officer answered calmly. Because it means this call wasn't made on behalf of the HOA. Karen blinked. I am the HOA president. That may be true, the officer replied, but associations still require board decisions for enforcement actions. Karen looked stunned. I didn't think that mattered. The officer shrugged slightly. It matters when police resources are involved. Karen looked down at her clipboard again. It no longer looked like a symbol of authority. It looked like evidence. The officer stepped toward the stairs. As we mentioned, the department will review the report. Karen's voice came out barely above a whisper. And if they think I misused emergency services? The officer didn't sugarcoat the answer. There could be fines. Karen swallowed. Or worse. The officer nodded slightly. In extreme cases, charges. Karen looked like she had just realized the full weight of what she had done. Her attempt to intimidate a homeowner had triggered something far bigger than HOA politics. She had brought police into a situation that never required them. And now there would be a permanent record of it. The officers began walking down the driveway. Before getting into the patrol car, the first officer turned back toward the porch. Again, Judge, apologies for the disruption. I nodded. Have a good morning, officers. The patrol car pulled away slowly. The neighborhood remained quiet for a few seconds. Then Karen finally spoke. Her voice was completely different from the one that had shouted demands earlier that morning. Judge Harper, I think I made a mistake. I took a calm sip of the coffee that had long since gone cold. I think you did, I said. Karen looked down the street at the neighbors who were now openly watching. Her authority had vanished. The clipboard, the threats, the dramatic police raid, all of it had backfired spectacularly. Instead of enforcing HOA rules, she had exposed her own abuse of power. And the entire neighborhood had just witnessed it. Karen slowly turned and walked down the driveway without saying another word. The HOA president, who arrived demanding compliance, left hoping the report wouldn't reach the wrong desk. Because if it did,
her next visit to the courthouse wouldn't be as an enforcer of rules, it would be as someone standing before them, and that was a position Karen had never imagined being in. If you enjoyed don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.